recording.
All right, I'm working now. I don't need to repeat that bit. So, when businesses are small and they're sort of kicking off and they're trying to get momentum, and this is like my gripe with the industry, is marketing companies in particular. I see them as kind of like the circling sharks, like they're sort of in the water, like anyone, right? They're in the water and they're smelling blood of like, oh, this business needs help. And I can certainly help them. And so what I tend to always do, my default is I'll go into these conversations and I'll say, look, here are 3, 4, or 5 things that I think you need to do yourself. And just based on the position. And usually, as Tommy said, he's right, I'll turn them away to go and do those things themselves, because there are a lot of things in those early stages that businesses can do themselves. And they often don't need necessarily a marketer at that point. Where a marketer or a marketing company like Menace starts to become valuable is as you're growing, as you've kind of done those hard bits to get that momentum, and you want to start scaling the business and start doing things differently, more professionally, that's when you're going to get the most value out of a strategic marketing company. And I know Tommy's got some questions for me, but sort of one of the things that I share with most businesses that where this all comes from my heart is I was on your side of the fence for most of my career. I was a client most of my career, and I literally employed probably 10, 15 different agencies over my career, all in different capacities, and have dealt with all of them from small agencies right through the Clemengers and the BBDOs. The challenge that I found is that so many businesses are very happy to sell you a solution, but it's not necessarily what you need. And so it's something that doesn't sit well with me. And often, as I said, often there's a handful of things that you could do yourself when you're scaling. But then as you do want to scale and you do want to change things and do things more professionally, that's where I really hit my straps, in that I'll come in, and Tommy then experienced that when Minerva came to us. They did a strategy day and they invested good money into spending a day with me and my team. But what they learned was that there's a process that as a marketer, I can unpack any business in the space of a day, understand their markets, their audiences, how they behave, use my 20 years of education and knowledge to be able to put that into, okay, here are the strategies and the tactics. And the biggest mistake that business owners tend to make is they jump straight to the tactic these days. So they're at a party and their mate says, oh, you got to be on Snapchat. You have to be on Snapchat. It's like, it's where it's all at. Maybe if your audience is 13-year-old girls, then yeah, Snapchat could be a good platform to leverage. The point being is there are plenty of tactics out there, and a lot of the tactics will work in some way. But where businesses go wrong is they don't understand the strategy, or they don't understand why they're actually doing what they're doing. So they do it because they think they need to, or they need to tick a box. But then what happens is that overwhelm kicks in, and they start going, okay, so now I've got to do Instagram, Snapchat, Facebook, Google Ads, website, lead magnets, EDMs. And all of a sudden these tactics start piling up, and they sit there going, holy shit, how am I going to do all this? Where often, whilst those things might be necessary, there's got to be a reason and a purpose of why you're doing them and how you go about doing them, which is what makes all the difference. Anyone can do posts on Facebook, but are you doing it with intent, with the right strategy behind it, with the right purpose in line with what your audience is looking for instance? So that's kind of my prelude. It's the number one mistake that businesses make is they jump to tactics and they don't spend enough time in getting their strategy right, knowing their purpose before they do the tactical bit. So that's kind of the one thing that I just want to get across before we jump into the questions, and just keep that in the back of your head, because we've all done it. We all do it. It's how we sort of survive when we kick off. But it's when you start to grow, that's where you can go wrong and really waste a lot of money. Tommy.
Wait, all right, guys. Thanks, Kev. If you've got any questions, guys, start punching them away in the chat box or start chipping away at them. I'm going to ask Kev a few questions that I think will kind of cover some of the basics anyway. My first question, this is something Kev made us do, and I hated doing it, and I've done it probably like 5 or 6 times since working with Kev, with every different marketing agency we've worked with. And every time I hate doing it, but it's working out or understanding your avatar client, or understanding your ideal client. So Kev, can you explain kind of what you mean by that and why that's actually important to understand? Because I look at that every time someone tells me to do it. I'm like, I don't want to do that. Like, it's so frustrating, annoying to do. But when you've got a bit of clarity around it, it actually makes a massive difference. And then when you're using your socials or your marketing, you can speak to the right person. So can you kind of explain how to find your ideal client or what that is?
Ironically, that sounds like burpees. So pretty much the same way I feel when you ask me to do that shit. So avatars, or what we call personas or avatars, are really important, because what we find in business is that for a lot of us, we could probably service anybody. Like, if you think about what we do, and I know I'm speaking generally, but like, let's just say, Leon, you can ship anybody stuff from anywhere. It doesn't matter who they are. If Kim, you've got people in the gym, you might have kids right through to, senior citizens potentially that could do gymnastics, hypothetically. So there's what we often think is we can do anything for anybody, or, our business can cater to most. And what actually we find hard, and I'll use Minerva as an example, that was a classic one, and we spent a lot of time on it, because Minerva in particular, and as a gym, we're a tribe, right? And people are tribal in nature. They relate to people that are similar to them. Before I did my strategy session with Tommy, he actually made me come in and do my onboarding and do a CrossFit session, which I was literally about to cancel the day before I was due to come in. Like, I was about to full pull out and just go, yeah, no, this is for me, because my perception of what CrossFit was to the reality was vastly different. Obviously, here we are just over 2 years later, and it's a very different scenario. And so what we want to think about is, if we're dealing with consumers, so if we're dealing with, say, the general public and we're selling to the general public, or if we're dealing with business owners or businesses, so that's what we would call B2B versus B2C, so business to business versus business to consumer. The strategy is the same, but we just apply them differently. So I'll use Leon as a quick example, Kelly too. Pardon me. So in a business to business environment where you're dealing with decision makers, what we tend to do is we need to think about who that ideal decision maker is, or who tends to make up the demographic of that decision maker. So when we look at personas, we look at 4 things in particular. We look at the demographic. So, how old they are they primarily male? Are they more female? We look at the geographic, where do they live? Do they come from certain areas? Do they travel? Socioeconomic, are they blue collar? Are they white collar? Are they, do they have an educational background? And then, how much money do they earn? Because you can be blue collar and earn a shit ton of money. You can be white collar and earn very little money. So knowing the socioeconomic is important. And then the psychographic. So how do they think? What do they value? What do they do for hobbies? Where do they spend their time? What has their attention? So they're the 4 things we look at when trying to create the ideal persona, or the avatar for our perfect client. So as a business, your goal is to always be focusing your energy on who are the people or the businesses that I want to do business with. So if you took my agency, we tend to work with 7, 8, and 9-figure businesses that are progressive and are looking to 10x their business. So we want to deal with businesses that want to grow to 10 times what they are. We are not looking traditionally at businesses who just want to float and kind of tick boxes, because that's just, we don't get a lot of enjoyment out of that. We certainly help a lot, and we still work with a lot in different ways, but our perfect customer looks like that. So If you're in the B2B sector or you're selling to businesses, you want to think about the decision maker. Are they typically male? Are they female? They could be both. But we find if you're dealing with middle management or upper management, they're probably going to be, in their sort of mid to late 30s to mid to late 50s. In some industries, they're more female dominated than male dominated. And you're thinking through who they are so that you can, when we get into the marketing side of things, we can understand how we can relate to them in everything that we do. If you're dealing with consumers, on the other hand, or say the general public, what you might want to look at is the perfect kind of customer. And you might even set 2 or 3 different personas. So you don't need to have just one. We have businesses where we might have 5 different personas for different products and different buying behaviors or different needs. So think about the same principles, their demographic, how old are they? If they're, let's take Kim's business, for instance. Let's just say gym students. If the average gym student was primarily female, aged, 5 or 10 to, was that 7? Is that 7? Yeah, cool. 7 to 21. I don't know. A bit less. I'm just taking that as an example. So primarily female, age 7 to 21, 20, whatever it might be. When we look at that audience, like what has their attention? So we know it, certainly under the teens or the lower teens, they're maybe just getting into Facebook. If their parents have let them, if they're over 13 and their parents are pretty sensible, they would have let them go on Facebook. They probably have a bit of attention on Instagram. They're definitely on Snapchat, on TikTok for sure. So anyone under 13 these days is pretty much on TikTok, or between 7 and 13 would be on TikTok. And I'm just talking about channels, right? As in, where is their attention going? So what we know is how old they are, where do they live? So they're probably coming from a geography. They're not going to travel from Queensland to your gym every day. It doesn't make sense. So you've got a limited geography of where you're dealing with. Socioeconomic. So to be able to afford to do gym, there's probably a level of household income that their parents would need to have. So they're typically not earning the money that they're spending on their own gym membership. Their parents are spending that money or investing that money. And so what you then have, so now I'm going to add a layer to this persona. You know who the customer is, but then what we have is what we call a primary customer and a secondary customer. So the primary customer is the person who holds the purse string, but the secondary customer is the person who influences or may benefit from that decision. So in this instance, the parents are the primary customer. They're the ones you have to convince. They're the ones that you have to keep engaged. They're the ones that you're going to communicate to as part of one of those avatars. But then just as equally, you're communicating to the students or the potential students, their friends, and the people who influence the circles of their friends. So that I've really tried to cram a pretty big piece of marketing theory into a short sort of synopsis, but hopefully that helps understand how to pick your perfect client, whether they're a business client or whether they're a consumer, and how by understanding their demographic, their geographic, their socioeconomic, and their psychographic, we can then better communicate to them in the channels that we use to appeal to them. And that's everything from your emails to your SMSs, to your website, to your social media, to the letters that you send out. Maybe everything needs to be aligned with that perfect customer. All your advertising needs to be aligned with that. No point sort of saying, hey, gym's for everybody, as an example, and we did that with Minerva, and that was probably one of the hardest decisions that I know Tommy had to make and Mark had to make when I went through it with them. Was we're pretty strict on the no dickhead policy. Minerva is not, everyone feels comfortable, from 50+ year old women to 18-year-old blokes can be in the same class, and we've got a dynamic that's respectful and friendly. We don't take ourselves too seriously. We all like to have a bit of a laugh, and that was where actually the +1 strategy came out of, because that was one of the first times we said, well, hang on a second, everybody in the gym we really like, and we've got we've got a good membership base. Imagine if every member that was in Minerva could just bring one person along, could get one person to come along with them, do their mobility. And that's how we created +1, and you got the cool singlets. It's like, everyone who brought someone and who signed up, got the merch. So it was a limited edition merch. So, you only got that, you couldn't buy it. So it was something creating a bit of fun within the box.
Sweet. I think Kel has got a question as well for you, Kev.
Oh, yeah.
It says, most of our clients have government funding attached to their services. How would you best market to these client types?
Kelly, classic question. That's massive. Because what Kelly's talking about, guys, is effectively, is that NDIS funding. So this is huge. I've literally done an hour presentation on this to people in the mobility sector, to occupational therapists. So the most important thing there is knowing your primary and secondary customer. Actually, it's so who is, depending on the client, who is making the decision and who is influencing the decision. So if there was like a disability involved, depending on the severity of the disability, the person who is disabled is not necessarily making the decision. Their carer, their OT, their doctors, all of them influence that decision. There's also, as I understand it, a level of, compliance, assessment that needs to take place in order for them to receive your services. So who's giving them that assessment? Who's doing that assessment? Right? They actually become a secondary customer. So that's a huge one. I don't know, that's where we're probably gonna do some stuff later down the track, Kelly, but that's what I'd be thinking about now, is who is making the assessment, who is influencing how that money is spent, and that government funding is spent for those services, and then thinking about how you can best communicate with those guys. And it could be, face-to-face, running small workshops in like, I don't know, what does best practice NDIS cleaning services look like? What should you expect from the service providers? What is best practice service provision for NDIS patients, NDIS clients? Again, super top level, I know, but hopefully that, just for the sake of time, hopefully that paints the picture. It's really about who influences the decision with NDIS. That's the most important thing. Hope that helps. Leon, love your work. Oh, thanks, mate. You started my course. You're a ledge. Awesome. Okay, Gibbsy. Kev, schools are quickly becoming businesses, both in the way they operate and in the way they market themselves. Quite funny for government schools, as they have drawing areas. But I see people going crazy, spending hours at my work with social media platforms. They're trying to tick the Instagram, Facebook, email, newsletter, even TikTok now. Any advice for that? I'm sure they could be more efficient. Seems like an overload of tactics. 100%. 100%. So big difference between private schools and public schools, in that private schools in particular, they are fighting more than ever for relevancy, and to be able to validate that premium, they need to market as a business would, as aggressively as a business. Government schools by default have that business anyways, as in there's always going to be students coming to the public schools. They're not necessarily fighting for the attention as much as the private schools would. I think I need to ask one question in relation to this though. What is and this is maybe one to either respond now or to think about, is why are they doing it, and what is the purpose? And especially in government schools, what is the purpose of that activity? Do you think? Poor reputation. So if schools, I guess you're talking about your school, or you're seeing it in other schools as well? Yeah, your school. Okay. So, yes, absolutely. I could see why the schools would be activating the tactics and being across all tactics, because communication is critical for them, more so than most, because parents want to know that their kids are safe, their kids are being treated well, and are getting the best of the best. So I guess the advice, the question you've asked me is, any advice for that when they're doing it? I'm sure they could be more efficient. The advice I'd be giving is that strategy piece. It's like they need to take a step back, especially if they're spending money on this. Like if they're spending money or resource in this, they need to be very clear on what are the 2 or 3 things that they need to get out of it. So when we talk strategy, we're always looking at what is the return for that investment. If improving reputation is one, absolutely, I'd go all in on that. If they need to increase student engagement and they're going, all gangsters paradise, where they need to really engage their students because they're disengaged, again, absolutely, but they need to know the purpose of why they're doing it, not just doing it because they feel they have an obligation to be. And this is where people and businesses make so many mistakes. They feel obliged to be across the platforms, but they have no purpose or intent with what they're doing. You're not going to fix poor reputation by communicating consistently poorly. Like that's the reality. You can be on every social media, but if your message isn't on point, all you're going to do is aid the poor reputation. Does that answer your question, Gibbsy? Strategy there, mate. Really focus on who do we want to talk to? Why are we doing it for? Like, what are we doing it for, and why are we doing it? Kim, would linking accounts be the right road to go down to simplify and be more efficient? I'll unmute. I'll see if I can unmute you, because I just want to know what you mean by that. Kim, go for it.
So, like, I'm just saying that I do have my Instagram account linked with my Facebook page as well. So whatever I post to Instagram
goes to both.
Goes to both. But can you do that with any other platforms if you were going to,
Yeah. So you can
be on all of those platforms.
Yeah.
Given that my demographic is so broad.
Yeah. I know certainly if I were in your position, there's probably a couple of things that I would actually do. And this is, again, very kind of off the cuff, just with an understanding of it. This is going to end in 10 minutes. So a couple of things I would do. One thing I would do is what we call community-driven content. So I would look to your younger members to be driving the TikTok content within the gym, right? So that's something I do, is get them to get involved, have some fun, and they become your mini influencers, right? So there's a mini influencer strategy right there. You don't need to try and do TikTok. Like that's the thing. As the business owner, you don't need to be doing that. But your students, and a part of your students would be great to do that. The main comms, which are going to be primarily communicating to the parents and a portion of your older students, Facebook and Instagram, absolutely. To make that more efficient, you can use, you can obviously post from Instagram and that goes across to Facebook. You can use free software called Hootsuite. I don't know if you've heard of Hootsuite, HOOTSUITE. And that allows you to schedule posts and post them across multiple platforms. One thing I would be doing though is, in a similar vein, getting some of that user-generated content that I was talking about with your younger members, is getting maybe some of the older members to be doing your Instagram stories and feeding them to your Facebook stories. So again, it's tactical, but I sort of know, cutting through who your audience is, that's a great way of your post will communicate to parents, but the Instagram stories will relate a bit more to the students, the older students, and keep them engaged as well, which is, you know, one of the fundamentals of social. Does that answer your question? Is that cool? Thanks.
Actually, that's actually great. I've got a bit.
You're welcome.
I've been muted.
Cool. That's good. Oh no, I'll mute you now. I'll mute you. All right. Kim, done that. Similar to Kelly's question regarding marketing, our clients are mainly large construction companies, and we obtain the work via word of mouth. We are looking at other marketing options, however, not sure where to start. In fair, like that's for us is like a perfect client, right? It's Peter, construction businesses that are growing, most businesses will grow on word of mouth. You know, we still get referrals from 6 years ago when I started the business. My personal reputation has been probably the fundamental thing that's gotten us most business. But in the last year, I've been shifting away because I'm working on some other businesses, and I've had to get the team to start generating their own business. In the construction arena, and depending on how large you are, and who you're competing with, because that's something that will make a difference. You've got to look at who are the people that influence. So in construction, it's primarily architects, developers, potentially other builders. So like where you get smaller builders or subcontractors that might be getting exposed to bigger projects that may not be able to take them on themselves. Again, I'm just speculating here because I don't know the intrinsics of your business. But what we would typically do is we'd have to look at a strategy for what kind of construction company, you know, how many people do you employ? What do your numbers look like? What kind of margins are you working on projects? How many projects do you take on a year? What is your capacity? Because again, marketing and they're not having the capacity to fulfill the work is worse than not having the business sometimes. You know, understanding, say we do a SWOT, we need to understand what your strengths and your weaknesses are, your opportunities and threats. We need to know where you're positioned in the market against your competitors. You know, if you're working between Sydney and Newcastle, that's a pretty big geography. So you're going to really want to hone in onto where those projects are and how best to communicate with, or how to target the people that are actively looking for a large construction firm, for instance. There's a chance that depending on the decision makers, they may not be using, say, high pages or anything anymore because they're more for consumer jobs, but that might be more tender related. So what we look at from a marketing perspective is how we might use tenders. Okay, you work right across New South Wales, so yeah, big geography, right? So you know, how do you position yourself for tenders? How do we use digital technologies to influence tenders? Because you know, often with tenders now, decision makers who tender, they tend to not be as relationship driven as when I was doing B2B marketing. So what that means is those guys have a tendency to like just go, you know, they'll go out to 5 construction companies and say, here's our scope of works, give us your best price, and it's like you're fighting for peanuts. So the businesses that we've worked with in that space, we've shown them how to reverse that equation. So whilst they might be going into what we see as a competitive pitch, they've used their marketing assets in the background to do the relationship stuff for them with those target customers, so that the target customer has this information in the back of their head going, yeah, I've seen that guy and I've heard of those guys and they've got a great reputation and I've seen their portfolio and, you know, I've followed them on Instagram and I've done this and I've done that and I've done that. All this work, all this marketing has done that heavy lifting for you in the background, so that when the tenders are out there, they're looking at it and go, okay, these guys might be a bit more expensive and be a premium, but I know they're a much better company. So this is because usually for most businesses and most decision makers, price is the 5th most important thing. It's often not the most important, but when you start off in a discussion about a sale, price is the number one thing that you tend to start a conversation with, because it's the easiest thing to equate value in somebody's mind. So value comes from somebody's ability to articulate their USP, which we'll get to in 3 minutes, the unique selling proposition, and what it's going to cost for that. And so often what happens, we know as business owners, when we give prices to people, they're often comparing apples and oranges, because you know where you can provide more value, and it's easy for them to push back on what they think is an expensive price. If I said to you, it's going to cost you a minimum of 10 grand a month to market your business, but I know the ROI on that is going to get you $1 million or $100,000 on average for every 10 grand you spend, you're going to get 100 grand back. Versus another agency which might say, well, I've got it's going to cost you 2 grand, but you're going to get nothing back. You don't know that until you've understood the value, and that's where I guess your assets come into in that same way, for you to be able to differentiate yourself against the other construction companies. So I hope that helps, Peter. I think that's it for questions so far. Tommy, I know we've got 2 minutes to go. Is that going to just can us, isn't it?
Yeah, we'll in about 2 minutes time.
Cool. I'll quickly touch on USP, unique selling proposition. Unique selling proposition is the intersection of, imagine 2 circles coming together like a Venn diagram up there, 2 circles coming together. It's the intersection of what your customers want and what you do well. And if you can articulate that, what your customers want and what you do well, if you can articulate the intersection of those 2 things, that is a really fundamental, that's going to be basically the difference why people will use you over someone else. That was just one of the questions Tommy had, so I thought I'd answer it. Any other questions in the seconds we've got to go before the buzzer goes? Awesome. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks heaps, Kev. I think heaps of the biggest thing I took away from working with you was understanding your ideal client. And so much of what you said today just comes back to, if you understand your ideal client, you can speak to them in their language and on their platforms that they use. And then you're actually going to resonate with them. So I think that was probably the biggest takeaway from working with you guys. And that's kind of what you kept saying today to these guys. And I'm sure Kev's got a formula, or Kev's got a kind of system where you can sit down and actually nut out who your ideal client is. But I've done that so many different times, and that helps so much if you actually sit down and take the time to do that.
Yeah, you've got to do it in context with the rest of the marketing strategy. That's where the value is and understanding your business, where you want to go, who you want to be, then who do you deal with, and then how do you take those people and make sure that every strategy is so pointed on just those people, and stop wasting your money on anything else. If newspaper was still relevant, go all in on newspaper. If TV still had a place, we'd use TV. I don't care if it's Facebook or LinkedIn or newspaper. For me, I'm